back to FGCC Reads Comments and Q&A. This is following the Gnostic texts on the origins of the world. First comment coming from a couple months ago from the video 1, Hypostasis the Archons. Now this is a lengthy write-up by Ready 1, Fire 1, Aim 1, so I'm not going to read this entire write-up, but it does go into speculation regarding what's called monadology. Essentially, what is the essence of the monad, really, or what are monads? So you are welcome to go read that. Again, it's video 1, Hypostasis of the Archons, Ready 1, Fire 1, Aim 1. Thank you for this very descriptive, detailed write-up. And also welcome here at FGCC if I haven't. Moving on to our next comment, we have Lake Sandivers, I think it is, who he or she talks about patriarchy not being bad, and that they feel I'm suggesting that patriarchy is a bad thing. I don't actually believe there is a good or bad per se about anything. It's more a matter of how you implement and use that something, whether it's an actual physical material thing or a concept that governs a society. I don't believe that hierarchical structures tend to serve the higher good. Ultimately, they can certainly serve it toward that ends, but in the end of it all, if you have a balance of the feminine energy and the masculine energy, I think that's what will bring about the best outcome. Now, certainly patriarchy or matriarchy in and of itself is not in any way or form a good or bad thing. It just is. So it's what we do with that something that makes it of use in a beneficial way or a destructive way. So Lakes Sandivers, thank you for being with us and for your comment and your openness. Mayam D8898 says, it isn't Jacob that's struggling, it's God. Love that. Commenting from video 3, I love that as well, from that write-up on the origin of the world, how the heavens are organized. Mayam D8898, thank you for being with us here at FGCC. Dorisi824, or Dory, I call her. I've read many of her comments, and I always enjoy what she has to offer us here. She says, is there a Gnostic text that gives their view of a chosen people? Gnosticism really does not talk about a chosen people in the way that maybe some have interpreted canonical texts, for example, the Hebrew or the Israelites being the chosen of Jehovah, or the Worldwide Church of God believing that extensions of the Israelites scattered throughout the world are chosen people of God in various different nations. Maybe some people, different nations and tribes, may also believe that. I personally do not ascribe to any kind of chosen people. Everybody is equal in the eyes of God. Now, it is what we do with what we've been given that ultimately will bring about whether or not our name is written in the book of life. That's the way I understand Gnostic text and canonical text when I read them together, ultimately. Gnostic text really, in my understanding, makes it clear, much more centered on equity across the board, much in the way that Christ spoke. There's neither male or female, Jew or Gentile. And the way I understand that, ultimately, via the lens of what I've read from the Gnostic text, as well as the canonical text, and meditate on that, is Christ ultimately saying there is no hierarchical structure. There are no chosen or unchosen people. There are merely people that are called, and when they are called, meaning that they are ready to pursue whatever they've been seated to pursue. That's why they've been brought into this Kanoma realm. At that point, when they make a choice to ready themselves and be open to the Spirit of God working in them or the Christ within, then they are chosen. So it's not of any particular lineage, material lineage, or flesh-oriented or carnal lineage. It's not a matter of you are a particular tribe or nation. These are all human inventions, ultimately. Gnostic text doesn't really go into that. Dory, in the passage about Jacob struggling with God, Jacob ended up naming the place where it happened, Pineal. Do you see this as the same word, pineal, meaning the pineal gland you're referring to? He said he saw God face to face, and the pineal gland is supposed to be where our soul resides. Yes, there are some that look at the Bible not so literally, but much more metaphorically, that maybe pineal is referring to the actual pineal gland and not an actual physical place. and that Jacob had some kind of transcendental experience that got in touch with the innermost sanctum of self, which is the more we go, as it says, Christ is within. Certainly, I've heard this way of understanding the Bible as well as Gnostic texts, so I don't discount it one way or the other. Frankly, I don't ultimately have the answer. I will only say that I can certainly understand why people have that particular way of understanding Scripture. And again, there's where I remind people, I'm not saying necessarily to you, Dory, but just anybody, it's about the message of Christ and not the messenger. So if your vehicle is through astrology, or it's through astral projection, or it's much more strict adherence of literal interpretation of the Bible, then that's what is right for you, best for you, if that's in fact not hindering you from ascending and growing as a person, and you're not standing in the way others unfolding in their natural selves to their fullness, their pleroma, if you will. Now, when you talk about he said he saw God face to face, you put God here in capital, but Christ said that no one before him had even seen God, nor even knew of him, including Moses. So I believe you're probably referring to a lowercase, quote-unquote, God of this world, if even Jacob probably was. Or maybe he had some type of spiritual experience, and it wasn't an actual seeing of God, but a sort of, a metaphor, I guess, of seeing God in some way. Now, here you talk about, didn't the Gnostics believe our soul comes from the Demiurge? Actually, it was the Demiurge that created the physical body and all his minions, but it was Sophia who she incarnated soul-oriented. If you remember in the Secret Book of John and on the Origin of the World, where it talked about she came and the Demiurge was breathed gnosis, or the breath of life, and gave it to man, and it brought it to life. It was the Sophia residing unknowingly to the Demiurge. So that wasn't really of the Demiurge. It was not something willfully the Demiurge sought to do, to give man a soul, or a human a soul, but rather it was that the gnosis that was residing in the Demiurge was breathed into man. That brought about that awakening. Breath of life brought about the ability to animate the physical body. So it really was not the Demiurge that gave man its soul, but rather it was a gift given to us by Sophia. That's the way I understand Gnostic texts. You gloss over Jake residing over the 12 signs way too fast. Could you say a lot more about that, please? But how in the world do you get Jacob being a descendant of Cain? Now, I don't recall saying that Jacob is a descendant of Cain. If I did say that, I misspoke. I think that the canonical text suggests that it's of the lineage of, it couldn't be Abel, because Abel was already, unless Abel already was married and had children, which I don't recall Genesis having made that clear. And so we can't truly say from which Jacob came from, really, ultimately. It sort of just skips ahead. We could say it's from Seth, perhaps, or it was some other lineage that wasn't spoken of in the canonical text from the progeny of Adam and Eve. I just don't know. So again, I may have misspoken. The Bible says Isaac is his father, the son of Abraham. They came from Seth, not Cain, right? I really don't have an answer to that, because it doesn't make it clear. And anyone suggesting that, I think, is really just speculating, ultimately. But getting back to the 12 signs, yeah, it's such a very exhaustive topic to explain. This is why I don't go into that, and it's really not part of, the details is not really serving me to go into that there. In that video 3 on the origin of the world, how the heavens are organized. But yes, going into the Mazzaroth, we're going into the designation of the 12 signs, each of the sons of Jacob representing one of the signs of the zodiac, the 13th being the sacred sign of the zodiac, which is of the serpent. But I'm not going to go into all of that here again for the sake of time. But I will continue to bring up just bits and pieces of that, so we begin to have more and more of a collective of information through time that we grow in understanding of that. So thank you, Dory, for your just great questions, and I can see you're just very well read and studied in the details of the Bible and getting into the Gnostic text as well. Rosolo, I was invited to 2 weddings coming both, and saddens me, no doubt, they're going to be fruitful and multiply. He or she says that probably with irony. But yes, this is from video 4 on the Origin of the World. Demiurge punishes man with suffering and death. And in that video, there was a implication that mankind or humankind really ultimately is in this realm through Genesis or genetics, which is the 2 helix, the helix, which really is ultimately the enrapturing of the spirit. And that helix then requires man to become impassioned and then continue to have progeny, and have intercourse and just continuation. And that has a withering because you're giving that sperm and that egg and they're coming together, but they're limited in their nutrient and their process, and then they eventually deteriorate and fade away. And then only way to continue that cycle, of course, is continue to have intercourse and passions and intercourse and children and all of that, and just continuation of Genesis, the genetic stream. Now remember, Christ hinted at and Paul talked about that everybody would burn in passion, but it's better that you not burn in passion recklessly, in other words, promiscuity and just having all kinds of sex and just recklessly, mindlessly, and, STDs and, getting just a reckless world, really. It is better that you marry. So in other words, even marriage ultimately is, in the mind of Christ and Paul, was a way to kind of discipline the mind and the human in their passions to commit to something in a sort of symbolic monogamy, because that is ultimately training that human being to learn to commit to and focus on the task at hand, or whatever their mission is while they're here. So that's ultimately, and that's its highest form of expression, because when we go to the pleroma, there's a full dedication to what's called our consort, and that's eternal, really. And so this idea, and you will find that some of the angels, we talked about in canonical texts, even left their lofty homes because they were persuaded by the beauty or the fairness of women, and they left their estate and came down to mingle in the lowly human flesh, cesspool. So, and ultimately, I'm getting to this because Rosolos talks about this too, and sort of implies humorously, ironically, that this fruitful and multiply, people often think that as being this beneficial thing, a good thing, ultimately. But even Christ and Paul talks about that this is what's keeping you in this flesh realm. So anyway, just food for thought. So thanks for that, Rosolo, and welcome with us here at FGCC. And Dory says, wasn't that actually the Star of Solomon? Talking about, everybody knows it as the Star of David, but Dory says that there is some historical suggestion that it's not actually the Star of David, but it in fact is the Star of Solomon. And then we get into the Zionist and the true Israelites, and there's this whole discussion around that. Even though we've been told it's David to make people accept it easier, question, some of the Solomon's wives were Canaanite women, and that is the Star of Remphan. Yes, there is some discussion and disagreement about that, Dory. I do agree with you, but I'm essentially using the symbolism. Even the Star of Solomon may represent something altogether, something different in terms of where it's derived from and who originally brought it about. It still doesn't take away from the understanding of the triangle pointing up as being of the spirit, triangle pointing down being of flesh, as above so below. That was my point, not necessarily, if it really is the Star of David or really the Star of Solomon. There's all kinds of disagreements over that, and again, it's just not that important to me. And I encourage people not to think of it getting into the weeds of that, unless it's something you really want to study and you really want to edify yourself about, and edify other people about, so that we get a more correct understanding of maybe where some of these terms derive from. So thank you, Dory. And then Dory says, did the Gnostics ever give a timeline for this creation? What about animals, especially dinosaurs? Did they exist and when? No, unfortunately, Dory, neither the Bible nor the Gnostic text goes into those details. The Bible and Gnostic texts especially the Bible, is a very historical text, like a particular lineage of people, as you know, the Hebrew in particular, and then ultimately the Israelites, and then the Jews, and their first sort of entanglement with Gentiles, and how to make a new world where Gentiles and Jews could get along side by side. But it really doesn't go into scientific fossils and things like that, and how long ago dinosaurs existed. Now, it does hint at certain things, like, for example, Leviathan, and talk of dragons and lizards, large lizards. This is suggestive, perhaps, that there were, the Bible and the Gnostic texts are kind of implying that these existed even before, we started having carbon dating and fossils brought up. Now, ice ages and global resets like floods are an example of perhaps a global reset. You can get certain things about different geographical, meanderings and nomadic movements that suggested different kinds of terrain, and manna falling from heaven could have been snow. It's just very hard to say. How does this all stack up against science saying we have a very old earth? Now, Gnosticism, and I believe even the Bible itself, if you take the first chapter of Genesis, the 6 days of creation and the 7-day rest, literally, then yes, you're going to think the earth is just 5,000 years old, 5 or 6,000 years old, going back to Adam and Eve being the first, mother, father, if you will. Then yeah, I think that it would be hard pressed for you to imagine, Earth or the universe, if you want to believe there's a universe, being more than a few thousand years old. Now, if you open up to see, the Bible is very illustrative in its way of sharing its mythos, or its ethos, or its kind of, its cosmogony, all of that it's much more nuanced. Some is metaphoric, some are allegories, some are fables, some are actual literal sayings, and it all is contextual. Then you could open up to the idea, and I think the Bible, as well as the canonical texts, make it very clear. The earth is millions of years old. There are hints about Atlantis existing, and a former earth that didn't have any intrusions or interest from the Archons, or the Demiurge, and that we were cast down and we were entrapped on earth, and that maybe many of us come from different planets even. So I think there's just a whole smorgasbord of implications and suggestions that you can take from these two bodies of work. Now, have you ever read Michael Cremo's book, Forbidden Archaeology, where he shows how extremely ancient this world is, even much older than science is willing to admit? I have not read that book, but it sounds interesting. He also wrote the book Human Devolution, which sort of goes with that, and is supposed to explain from the Vedic perspective how we got here. He has videos too. Well, thank you for sharing that. I'm definitely going to be looking into that, and if he has a YouTube channel, I'll definitely subscribe. There's another one that you might be interested in, Dory, and other listeners. I believe it's called The Fifth Kind. Paul somebody, I can't remember his name, but he has some great videos on, he doesn't go that far back into the past, but he certainly sometimes goes pretty far back, speculates, and, not goes beyond speculating. He digs up texts and books written on, archaeological finds and about human history going back millions of years, perhaps. Also, the fact that the reality behind the Old Testament is found behind older stories such as the Epic of Gilgamesh and Eptanishtim. Yeah, I think that's so clear to me. The parallels between the Sumerian text and the Bible and various other, even like Babylonian texts, Egyptian texts. There's just so many parallels. It's hard to imagine that they didn't all derive really from something way back before even the Bible. That it all just is an amalgamation of all the history, and the Bible really is through the lens of the Hebrew lineage, really, the Israelite, and it's really that one lineage. And that's where people tend to get myopic. They just think that that's it, and we're only supposed to look through that one lineage. That's why I think, again, it's important for us to be careful thinking that God just is, if you talk about Jehovah, yes, then Jehovah's going to make it very clear that he's the God of Israelites, and Israelites is his people, chosen people. then yeah, I think that you're going to set yourself up for hierarchies and all kinds of what's superiority complexes and things like that. But if you open yourself up and I'm not saying you're not doing the story, but I'm just saying in general that you begin to see the world and you begin to see all these parallels, and you see so much more than you ever saw before, and then you begin to see, wow, there's so many connections that are overlooked because I just was so focused on this just one little line, like a little straw, drinking out of a ocean, So anyway, thanks for sharing this. Is great information. Added to this is the fact that some authors say the humans we know ourselves to be today were bioengineered from evolving Earth primates, possibly going back to as far as 250,000 years. How does all this fit with Gnosticism? Absolutely fits in. Because in Gnosticism, we talk about the natural or the true self, and then we talk about the artificial world. The artificial world is the genetic world. Gnostic texts suggest that, and then it does sort of in the first couple chapters of the Bible as well, but that's sort of glossed over just in a couple of verses here and there. And it talks about in Peter where there's a former world that was flooded and then the world that was on fire, etc., etc. Then we've got the Gnostic text that I believe really talks about archons being artificial, and the Bible hinting at the Nephilim coming down to earth, intermingling with humans. Now, we would have to presuppose either one or two things. They already had the ability to have intercourse with humans, which I suppose is possible, but we definitely have to make a major leap on that. Or it could be that, as you wrote here, there was some type of bioengineering going on so that they could have some form of relation with the primates at that time. So, yeah, I think the Gnostic text leaves that open quite a bit. I left you a link for the book we were looking for. Yes, thank you for that. And then, Dory, what about where Paul says things like, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and thou shalt be saved? What is he saying to call Jesus Lord? Jesus said many will be cast out because they didn't do what he taught. Two things. First off, I like to remind people, Paul is not Christ. Paul is a human being. And all of the writers here, they are all inspired to write about God. What they write about is not perfect. They have, through their own understanding, their own lens. Paul was very much a Jehovah worshiper, and he had a hard time. He wrote books on how he struggled, Corinthians and Romans, with this idea that in just one swoop, Christ would die on the cross and everybody's sins would just be washed away, and that he was permitted to do everything. Before it was all these laws, and he just had a hard time with that. So for him, this hierarchical structure and this adherence to the law, he was very strict, even so much as to kill heavy-handed in the way he understood, because he killed other Christians, right? When he went to Damascus, of course, everything changed. When he met up with, well, some people say it was Christ, others speculate maybe it wasn't the Christ, but it says, why do you persecute me, Paul? Well, I guess my point here is that really only focus mainly on if you want something that is nearly 100%, even then it's not 100% because it's transliterated and translated. People want to put their hands into it, and then the Gnostic texts were torn out of the other 66 books. So there's no pure form of Gnostic text, no pure form of the Bible. That is not to discount what you're saying, but my point really is here on the first count is if you want to talk as close to what I believe is the message of the true Father and Mother, it is the words of Christ. Paul is not the Christ. Paul, I would say, he's one of the ones that I think really have a lot to say that I think is quite close to what the message of the monad is, but nowhere near as what the Christ has to say. Having said that, Paul is doing the best he can because he's living through the lens of, the Lord this and Lord that, and Lord God, and he's so used to speaking that vernacular, right? So that's the first thing I would say. Now, the second thing I would say is there's two terms for the word Lord, and one is actually Yahweh, which means Lord, and then the other one, I'm going to bring you over to this Bible Hub Lexicon, that is kudos, authority. Now, what does that mean, master, authority? It doesn't mean in the sense of I am your master as you're my slave, but it means much in the way that Christ is the authority on the true understanding of the Father Mother. In that sense, not as in if I say Christ is Lord, what I'm saying is Christ is the authority on the message of the true Father Mother. He's the authority. That's ultimately what's being said here. Not levorid, which is dominus. There's two. That's the other word. That's the Latin dominus, which is someone dominates over you. And then there's hyrios, which is in the New Testament, has a different understanding. That is literally one who guards the loaves. And the loaves was often talked about as the bread of life, meaning the essence of truth. And so that is what ultimately Christ is. He is the guard. He guards the truth, or he shares the truth. And so he is the authority on that truth. That makes him Lord in that understanding of that term. Not as in, I'm Lord. Even Christ talked about, don't call me a God. Don't worship me. I'm not anybody's Lord. I'm not anybody's God. So we go back to who really is the most pure. You want to get it from Christ first. Christ made it very clear that he didn't want anybody to worship him. I'm not anyone's master. But he did often refer to himself as the father of the house. He's not the father of the house. The father of the house is God, right? The mother, father. They are the master. But even then, that is mastership, or you could think of it as, we're all in a type of apprenticeship, and the mother, father are the masters of that truth. You might call it a sensei or a mentor, whatever you want to call it, your grand teacher. That's ultimately the way that that is what I believe is being suggested there. Now, the next part of what you say here is, Jesus said, many will, you talk about thou shalt be saved. So it's important we understand this whole passage. I'm taking you to Romans chapter 10 because this is brought up quite a bit, and people believe that it literally is, I've got to say it with my tongue, Jesus, you are Lord, and Jesus, you died for me on the cross for 3 days, and I confess all my sins, and I'm wretched, and I'm horrible, and forgive me of my sins, therefore, then I'll be saved. And that's the way people have been taught in the Orthodox Church. Now let's go to Romans chapter 10, and we're going to get eventually to verse 9, that very infamous chapter and verse. And let's see if that's actually what's suggested here. Remember, Paul is writing from all the other 9 chapters before. He started out with Romans chapter 1. He talked about worshiping all of these different animals, and then he got into man and woman leaving the original intention of what sex was intended for, which was in the confines of marriage and love, and that they lusted after each other and did all kinds of unseemly things, which was, you name it, men with men doing all kinds of unseemly things, whether it be group rape or prostitution or promiscuity, and men with men even having homosexual sex out of lust. There was no love there. There was no marriage. It was not in a commitment to anything. Just a kind of, frivolous, no commitment to any mission, any kind of purpose that ultimately just sort of makes you to meander, and you don't go anywhere, and you don't produce anything, not as in producing as in children, but children even in the sense of progeny, but even your child could be your work, whether writing a book or writing a program for a computer system, whatever it is, right? So that kind of mindset that Paul was talking about, and how people were struggling with that, and he was struggling with it too, because when Christ came, he talked about how he fulfilled all the laws and the prophets. Those were no longer necessary, and the only commandment now was to love one another, love God and love everyone else, and do unto others you'd have them do unto you, and also not to judge anybody, and to give to the poor, all of that in the Sermon on the Mount. And Paul struggled with all that because he was so accustomed to laws, and so he talked about like how he just struggled with that, just 8 chapters of it, and he shared it with everybody how he understood they struggled with it, but he spoke in the language that they could hear, which he did it very, very, very craftily, because so much so that preachers today can get up on the pulpit and talk about as though Paul is forcing women not to talk in the churches, and they're supposed to wear things, like they're supposed to wear cloth over their heads, and, you're not supposed to eat certain kinds of food, and, it's just this whole way of this strict kind of understanding of the Bible, right? And very nitpicky and cherry picky, right, about what people can and can't do, and just pastor to pastor would differ on that based on probably what the pastor wanted to do, and because he or she wanted to do it, then that was okay, but everything else was not, because they didn't struggle with that, so no big deal. Now he's sort of summarizing And all of this, ultimately, it doesn't even matter. The law, it doesn't matter. What's in your heart and all of that is ultimately what matters. Whether or not you really get at the heart of everything that God is love and God doesn't care about all those little details, and that it really is about you understanding your worthiness to receive the good news. And the good news is that God loves you just the way you are, and you are a son and daughter of God, and that your ultimate purpose is whatever mission was seated in you, your name, and to be written in the book of life, which is to fulfill your mission. And when you've done that, then you find fulfillment, and then you find the pleroma, which means fullness, right? And that's what heaven means, by the way. It also means fullness. And so when you find that fullness, then you rest. You go back to the pleroma and you rest, or the Holy Souls realm and you rest. And then you can decide if you want to come back. So forth and so on. So it goes. Now, there's where he is now. He's now at that place where now at chapter 10, he's saying to you, brothers and sisters, my heart's desire and prayer to God for the Israelites is that they may be saved. Now, he's saying them, the Israelites in particular. Why is he saying that? Because the Gentiles had no problems with this, very little issue with it, because they were already kind of living with very little, quote unquote, spiritual man-made laws. And they were more in tune with nature and following, just trying to be good to one another. And that's ultimately what God would look at, But not the Israelites. It was all about, the Old Testament and the Ten Commandments and the Levitical law, and put this over here and you can't do that, and if you do this then you go stone this, and if your children do that, stone them, and you don't do that. And so it was very strict, and it was very pious and hypocritical and even racist. They looked down on anyone that wasn't Israelite, even like killing them, and their God, go kill them and bash their babies' heads against rocks. This is their mindset, see? So they were wearing this stone around their neck. So he's really, first thing you want to understand is Paul is so interested because he himself is an Israelite, and he's worried about his own people. He's saying, I want them to be saved, but they just don't get it. Verse 2, for I can testify about them that they are zealous for God. For zeal is not to be based on knowledge. But it's not about whether or not you know how that candlestick goes, or what kind of animal you're supposed to kill, and how long you're supposed to burn it. And, it's not about all those little details, what's right and what's wrong. It's not about that. And this word knowledge is not the same as gnosis, by the way. It's about the details, like a subscript, like this, like a recipe. How many pieces of this and that? This goes over that. So that's what he's referring to. Verse 2, since they do not know the righteousness of God, in other words, they actually believe God is good and evil, and that God can get angry, and God will strike you down with lightning and put you into hell and let you burn forever and ever, whatever, and that God is really intrinsically kind of bad, right? Since they do not know the righteousness of God and sought to establish their own, they did not submit to God's righteousness. So now, people will often read this as meaning the Israelites were just reckless and they were sinful and they were evil. Well, that's the opposite of the way we understand the Israelites in the Bible. They were very strict to the codes of the Levitical or Mosaic law. If anybody was, it would be the Israelites that were righteous, quote unquote, righteous. But no, instead, they sought to establish their own rules, is what's being said here, right? Now, 4, Christ is the culmination, meaning the ending. Culmination means it's over. That's it. He is the embodiment of the law. So there may be righteousness for everyone who believes. And what's the believing? It's not believing, Jesus died on the cross and whether he historically was ever here, or, and I'm a wretched sinner and you died for me so that my sins could be cleansed. That is a very orthodox understanding of what it means to believe. Believing means that you understand that why Christ came here to fulfill the laws and the prophets, meaning that when they're fulfilled, they're done. There are no more laws and prophets. If you believe that, then yes, you're going to understand that you are good at your core. Now, you may not do good things, but that's not because you are bad, no more than a kid who does things that are hurtful or unhealthy because they're ignorant. or they don't need to do better, or they're weak, or whatever it happens to be. But it doesn't mean intrinsically that little child is bad. 5. Moses writes this about the righteousness that is by the law. See, he's making it very clear that Moses wrote about this righteousness. The righteousness is attained through some kind of set of rules. The person who does these things will live by them. But the righteousness that is by faith says, Paul is comparing, he's literally contrasting Mosaic law to the new law by Christ. And it's not even a law. He's saying that, but the righteousness that is by faith says, do not say in your heart, who will ascend into heaven. That is to bring Christ down. In other words, don't judge others. This person's going to go to hell. That person's going to go to heaven. Because when you do that, that is to bring Christ down. Because Christ already said that everybody's going to go to heaven. Everybody in their own time. It's not a matter of who's going or not going. There is no heaven or hell, really. There's just a fulfillment of your mission. That is it. And so Christ talked about that. Or who will descend into the deep. That is to bring Christ up from the dead. See, these are things that make what Christ came here to do a vain, because that wasn't anything he talked about. Like, he did away with all that. 8. What does it say? The word is near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart. So you don't need other people. You don't need man-made laws or governmental laws tell you what you can and cannot do, what you're permitted and not permitted not to do. Paul even says that everything's permitted, but not all things are prudent. So even Paul, who was one of the most strict, is telling you that everything is permitted, because if it's not permitted, then how can there be truth? Because it's only in the experiencing can we have the true essence of that truth, right? You can talk about it all you want, but until you actually experience it, then you don't really get it. So the word is near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart. That is the message concerning faith that we proclaim. Verse 8, he's telling you it's about what's in your heart. It is about what you proclaim. It is about what it is that you confess, make a vow or admission of, to admit. Now, there's another one akin to it, fati, which means to speak, but that's confati, not confess. Confess is to admit. In other words, you are, like if you get into a movie, you are given one ticket as an admission into the movie. So this is what that is saying. It's saying if you allow yourself in, if you just admit to yourself, you don't have to declare it to everybody else. Now, if you declare it with your mouth, Jesus is Lord, that's what Paul is saying. If you declare it with your mouth, Jesus is Lord, and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. He's specifically saying this to the Israelites. That's the other thing you want to keep in mind. The Israelites have a hard time, so he wants to make it as simple as possible. If he went into, it's just about the concept and, of believing in the essence of the ethos of Christ and his mythology and what he stood for, that's really what's about, then the Israelites going to be like, what are you talking about? But if you just makes it simple, just say it out loud, start exercising it, and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Okay? Now, think about the simplicity of that. Even there in verse 9, it makes it seem, if we looked at that as just reading verse 9, and that was it, right? Then laws don't even matter. It doesn't matter what you do. If we take the Orthodox interpretation, it would mean simply, well, I just say it with my mouth, Jesus is Lord, okay. And I believe in my heart that God raised him from the dead. Okay, well, I can believe that. I don't necessarily have to believe, anything else. What am I being saved from? Paul is telling you he's trying to save. What is he saving the Israelites from? He's trying to save them from the Old Testament God, from laws, those laws that are destroying people's lives. Okay, that's the other thing. It's not talking about going to the pleroma and fulfilling your mission. It's talking specifically about saving them from themselves. Trying to say it's just as simple as saying Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that he raised him from the dead, that God has that power, then you can be saved. For it is with your heart that you believe and are justified. It is with your mouth that you profess your faith and are saved. You don't necessarily have to say it out loud. It's just Paul is telling you that a very direct way of declaring it with your mouth. That's one way of doing it. Now, if you want to believe that literally, that's up to you. It's not going to hurt you to believe that if you wanted to declare it, but it is really, the essence here is about the faith of what Christ talked about. I am the way, the light, the truth. That essence of his message, that is the most important that we want to get from this. As Scripture says, anyone who believes in him will never be put to shame, for there is no difference in Jew and Gentile. The same Lord is Lord of all and richly blesses all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. If we go by Paul, all you have to do is just call on the Lord and say, I believe in you, and I believe you rose Christ from the dead. And that would be it, and you have to do nothing else. Keep this in context. He's talking specifically to the Israelites. All right, I don't know if that clarifies anything. Thanks, Dory, for that. My Jaininess. In some ways, this lines up with science. He's talking about Video 6, Secret Book of John, Sophia's Gift to Humankind, saying how it really is similar to the Big Bang. It's about the luminaries. You could think of them as planets. Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Understand why you are making that parallel. Thanks for being with us. Dory says this seems to more Eros sound a lot like Epicurus. Could you explain in what way? That'd be interesting to hear. Keith has right up here really a question, but he does talk about maybe the different kinds of languages that were spoken at the time of Jesus walking on earth. Thanks for being with us, Keith. And then Stephanie Parkinson 8436 says, Hi Thomas, this is my first time on the channel. It's very well presented, quite accessible to those with no study backgrounds. I wanted to share something weird with you and anyone who will listen regarding a vision, waking dream, where I was approached by a woman who said the following, Come to me, follow your bliss. I was so close to accepting, but suddenly hear the rattle of snakes and was almost overcome by a feeling of being surrounded by pure evil. I instantly came to and of course cast the thing out. You just reminded me of the association between ignorance and bliss. Anywho, the point of this is to warn you they are actively on the spiritual hunt, as really is beguiling. Please reject anything in whatever guise that offers you bliss. If you already accept it, I know it's under false pretenses. Get it out. Get help if you need it. Call on God. He will help you. Please don't respond with messages that I'm nuts. I can hear and read what I'm saying. I don't say it lightly, and you have free will. Sending you a big, fat, psychic hug. Pass it on, babes. XXX. Thank you much for this, Stephanie. I don't think you're nuts or crazy. I think this is wonderful. You're listening to your inner voice. Continue to do so, and I appreciate you sharing this. If it definitely rings a bell for anyone, I think she's got some great advice here. So thank you, Stephanie, and thank you for being with us. Retinal 08 says, maybe Mary who taught. She's talking about when the first teacher was a female. So it is very possible. Could have been some incarnation of Mary. Mary is certainly a one incarnation of Sophia. Dory says, you keep saying born again of the Spirit, but Jesus said born again of water and the Spirit is whole renewing of the mind and the first three elements therein. Thank you, Dory, for bringing about the fullness of what's talked about when Christ talks about being born again. So certainly, if you want to read about that and what Dory has to say, that's in video 2, Gospel of Thomas. And then famous Toledo says actually 552 years. Okay, a comment about how long humans lived according on the origin of the world before the Orthodox would call it the falling, kicked out of the real Garden of Eden, or Atlantis, if you will. He goes on to talk about it was actually 1,656 years. Thanks for being with this famous Toledo. He says the red orb is actually representing the phoenix. Thank you for that as well, and your take on that. Dora says, your teachings are generally wonderful, and I'm very grateful for them, but when you speak about gender orientation, which doesn't mish with 1 Corinthians, Galatians, Revelations, which speak of the condition of the flesh human from this world, not the soul human from above, which you differentiate between in the next video. Yes, so thanks, Dory. I'm really suggesting that people get caught up, and this is video 8 on the origin of the world, get caught up in their physical selves, and they begin to believe that's really what they ultimately are, that when Christ came, he's talking about our spiritual, that is of the most important. And that's what I'm talking about when I'm saying that Christ wouldn't have us go about and judge what people would do with their own bodies, because that's ultimately not what's going to matter. When I talk about those things, I'm encouraging people to feel invited to FGCC, because I do invite everybody, and that includes any transgender, and I also encourage people not to judge their walk. You will not know what it's like to be on their journey unless you are them. You walk in their shoe. So I continue to speak about that, and I will continue to speak about LGBTQ and support them and continue to welcome them, and that we don't judge here. As Christ, he asked us not to judge. That's not what we're about. We support everybody, and everybody has to make a decision on what they believe is right for them. Ultimately, if anything, we want to provide a welcoming environment where if somebody is considering transgenderism, that they can open up and talk about it, and they can really have somebody to help them understand how to go through that process in a safe way, or even really think it through thoroughly, decide for themselves really if this is something they've been influenced by or something that really is something that they feel led to do. That's really all I'm talking about it from. I'm not suggesting that Scripture is talking specifically about transgender people. Transgender people are human beings, so that to me means they're included when I'm talking about any scriptures, because scriptures, the Bible, it's Gnostic, or the canonical text is talking about human beings. So that's all I'm referring to. I'm not going into the details of what the Bible does or doesn't say about transgender. Again, the Bible is not perfect. It's been corrupted. How do we know then what is not corrupted and what isn't corrupted? Again, I go back to the essence of what Christ's message is. And again, I think at the core of it, we get an understanding how important it is to love one another and support each other and edify each other and to not judge one another. And I'm not suggesting what you're doing here, Dory, but I think it's that you have such a great love and passion for the Christ and God, and that you want to really, get all your T's crossed and all your I's dotted, that that's important to you. And I don't want to take that away from you. Some may have been created by the Demiurge to be differently oriented, but it seems impossible that it would be by the perfect Father-Mother. Doria, going into this idea of what we do here on this earth is created by the Mother-Father, a very specific sort of like, I create you to everybody to be heterosexual and everybody to be quote-unquote cisgender, as though the Father-Mother is so meticulous in that and so interested in those details, because those ultimately matter, because that's going to save you or not save you. Again, that's what you're walking into, and that sort of soup of those details that really are going to get you to want to create kind of like they and us paradigms and hierarchies. And, I'm born a straight female and I am a heterosexual, and I don't even believe this cisgender or non-cisgender. I just believe I am the right orientation by God, because it's just, I don't struggle with that. And, it's only natural for you to want to and feel that down to your core. But until you're actually walking in the shoes of someone who's transgender, how can you know, right? Why would God create them to be condemned? Now, you're maybe suggesting that Satan did it or the Demiurge did it. Remember that women not to talk in the church, and women are the evil ones, and that they're the weak ones, and it was Eve who took of the apple. And we can go into all kinds of looking for scriptures that make it seem as though women are of the devil, whereas men are of God, right? And so you're doing a similar thing, but in this case, you're suggesting transgender thinking is of the Demiurge, and heterosexual thinking and cisgender thinking is of God. You see, it creates a kind of a division in thinking. That is the essence of what the Demiurge does, really. The devil, coming from that same word, devil, division. That's the essence of what the devil's purpose is. To transcend that, Christ says to not judge anyone. That dissolves all borders. And when I talk about that, do you really think that Christ, when he says there's no Jew or Gentile, no male or female, that was it? Christ is making a point about everybody is of God. That's really ultimately saying. He's not just saying, oh, male and female and Jew or Gentile, and that was it, and done. I'm done now. That's it. Wouldn't we need to see an example of this in Consorts of Paloma? But we don't. We absolutely do. We're not attached to a body. We're not a physical body where we have genitalia, a vagina or a penis. That is of this realm that requires intercourse and ejaculation and ovums being inseminated, so forth and so on. That's what you have in this realm. In that realm, besides the agistic pairs, it isn't what their bodies are, it is what they do, the essence of their purpose, their accomplishments, that determine if they're male or female. If they take on a form of emanation, then they are female. If they take on a willful injection, that are of male. So it's an attribute. It's not a physical form. It's not a male or female. Any of that. If anything, transgenderism in some way kind of suggesting that. Now, I'm not saying I support or don't support transgenderism. I leave it up to everybody to decide for themselves their own walk. There is no one male and one female to each consort pair. Again, male and female in a spiritual sense, Dory, not in a physical sense. You also have male attributes. You're actually projecting that when you write up these and share this with us. That is a male attribute. You're injecting your opinion into this comment section. A female opinion or way would be to to just be receptive and wait for it to come. That's what we talk about when we talk about the consorts. We're talking about Christ walking around with penis, Sophia walking around with vagina. Just as the mother, father, who themselves are male and female. Yes, male and female in their attributes, their essence of projection or rest and repose and movement, motion and repose. That is male and female. Male is motion, repose is female. That's all that means. There's not some kind of flesh thing that's being talked about here. Intends for it to be in the creation of the Elohim, just as Jesus reminded the Pharisees in the Gospel of Matthew. So you're going again, this is such a bugger, especially for those, a certain generation, maybe prior to the 1990s or so. They have a hard time with this. They really want so badly to, because this homosexual just made into kind of the scapegoat of all the woes. And there was a time when they were saying homosexual calls for this and that, and Jesus didn't talk about anything. He implied to accept them in Matthew. Maybe he doesn't specifically use the word homosexual. No, he does not. It's no maybe about it. Christ never used the word homosexual. He told them to remember what Genesis said about God's plan for marriage. No, that was not God's plan. He said the opposite of that, Dory. He was saying how that was not the plan of God. He even talked about there's no marriage in heaven. That is not God's plan. There's a spiritual marriage, not a physical marriage. We're very starkly in disagreement about ultimately what's being said here. But no, I do not want to spend time continuing to talk about LGBTQ, transgender people. If you are in fact LGBTQ, you are welcome on this channel. But I don't want to discourage you at the same time, Dory, from speaking your truth. I will continue to address these kinds of questions if you would like. If you want to direct the question to me. But if you want to just write this up, that's fine for other people to read. All right, thank you there, Dory, again. I see where Paul says in the Bible there's no longer male or female, a spiritual sense that Jesus taught, Jew nor Gentile, and the wrongly transliterated metaphorical sense the Bible teaches it. But where does it say there is no longer black or white, gay or straight? I think it's very evident to me that Christ is talking about there not being division when we stop judging each other. He's making it simplistic. He can't just go around and say, well, there's no more this, and that. There's no more, otherwise he'd just be sitting there forever. There are no Asians, there are no whites, there's no this, there's no, it's just for the sake of time, he made it brief, right? That's what my understanding is. I think it's more prudent to stick to how the scripture are written instead of adding words. I'm not adding words because I'm reading within the context of the entirety of the message of Christ and the message of the Gnostic text. In fact, I think that you are getting myopic and trying to make your point just based upon something very specific, Christ maybe did or did not say in a particular passage. And you're saying that that's the essence of everything. That's just one passage within the essence of everything. So your need to cling to this judgment, the LGBT community, think that that is going to cause a potential stumbling block for you because you'll continue to secretly judge them, even though you're kind on the outside about them. Jala Jalu writes up here about a program called Revelatorium, so feel free to read that. Welcome with being us here. Jala Jalu. Ralph Sterner calls the disobedient ones, lovers of power, Asuras. I think that actually means not of God, and I want to say Sanskrit, so that I think of what you're referring to there. Thank you for being with us, Jala Jalu 8588. Okay, so that wraps it up for today. Thank you for being with us and continuing with us, and we're going to be picking back up on the next great text of the Gnostic text. So we'll talk again soon.